Let me do a quick poll here. How many in the audience this afternoon have lived in Pensacola for more than 5 years? Oh, just about everyone. That's fine. That makes it a little easier. In the story of the emergence of downtown, since we have enough time to develop this subject a little bit, it's interesting to look at the fact that what we have today is a patchwork quilt of building styles, building materials, and of course building design. And what we need to look at if we're talking about the emergence is, how did we get here? What made one style transition into another? What were the economics of it? Who were the people behind it? What were their motives as they built it? That's what I'm going to try to do for you this afternoon. And I'm going to do it backwards. Instead of starting at the beginning, or the beginning of the downtown cycle, which would be about 1870, I'm going to start in the year 1914. Carl Mertens is here, and he's one person that I think can really appreciate what we're going to say first. 1914 was a critical year for this area. We had been for almost 45 years in the midst of a great lumbering boom. Because at the end of the war, the War of Southern Independence, or better still, the War of Northern Aggression. At the end of that unfortunate episode, Pensacola was on the southern edge of a 125-mile square forest of virgin yellow pine, a magnificent forest. Circumstances in Europe at that time suddenly opened the door to a new market. The Industrial Revolution there was almost a century old, and they suddenly woke up to the fact that they had to rebuild their cities to accommodate the masses of workers that were coming in. And to do that, they needed a large ongoing supply of inexpensive, dependable building materials, principally wood. And it just so happened that this area was sitting on the greatest reserve of that kind in existence and available in the world at that time. And so prosperity began in 1870, and when we get to 1913, it had been going on now for almost 45 years. And then in 1913, two things happened. And that tells the story of why we have a very unusual pattern in downtown Pensacola today. Things were going along well. And in the course of those 45 years, one of the first things that was done, of course, was they harvested the wood, the timber that was within just a few miles of what was then the downtown area, leaving a mass of area that was literally filled with rotting wood stumps. Well, about the same time, down in South and Central Florida, people began to wake up to the fact that the Yankees were interested in Florida. People began to develop properties, they began to sell land, and they were making money hand over fist. And so some of the bright young fellows, like this young man right over here, they said, you know, we can do that in Pensacola, because this land out here is practically ours for the asking. So this young band of men, about half a dozen of them, well thought of businessmen in the community, went to a new bank that had been open here just a few months. It was called the Bank of Pensacola. It was located on the corner of Palafox and Garden Street. And they proposed a loan of $100,000 to buy the land, clean it up, do the marketing, and so make money for everyone. And the bank, somewhat naively, said, fine. And they went to work. This is in the early spring of 1913. Come late September, the country went into what we would today call a recession. Some blamed it on Mr. Wilson's new income tax. There may have been other factors involved, but whatever it was, business went to hell in a handbasket. And this bank, by the time we got to the 1st of December, this bank, which had some other unfortunate loans, went to this group of young men and said, we're sorry, but we have to call your loan. And they said, well, we would be tickled to death to repay you. We will just as soon as we sell the land. We've spent the money. Long and the short of it was the bank closed. And with that closure went much of the liquid capital of a number of the businesses up and down Palafox and Garden Streets. 60 days later, almost to the day, Francis Brent, who was the president of the First National Bank, received a cablegram from overseas announcing that the firm of Crowe, Rudolph and Company, which was a financial house in Liverpool, which had handled the bulk of the financial transactions for lumber going into Great Britain for almost 40 years. The company had announced that it could not meet its obligations, and it had closed, owing the First National Bank of Pensacola $500,000. Well, Mr. Brent wasn't particularly disturbed. He knew he had $400,000 in gold in the vault. He knew that he could work his way out of that, he thought. But then the federal government, as was required, sent an investigator down, and by By tragic coincidence, the man's name was Goodhart. And within 72 hours, he had announced that the First National Bank must close. And as that happened, of course, much of the other reserves, this was the second largest bank in the, or the largest bank in the city, and much of the other reserves of many of the businesses in the commercial district were lost because there was no FDIC at this point. Put those two together, and we put Pensacola in a sort of a panic. Well, Mr. Brent, who was a very ethical man, sold many of his other properties, and he was an investor in many different things. He sold everything that he had except his holdings on buildings at the corner of Palafox and Garden. He made the sales so that he could try to pay something to some of his depositors who had lost so much. He worked himself literally into a frenzy, and this 60 days later, he came home one day. He lived up on the hill, and he usually walked home for lunch. He came home, told his wife he wasn't feeling well. He was going to lie down and take a little rest before lunch. Well, he never got up. The man died of a heart attack right then. This man was a financial giant in the community, and 3 days later they held his funeral. The funeral was held in the church, in St. Michael's Church. Then he was buried in St. Michael's Cemetery. It was an unusual day for April. It was cold and rainy, and the priest saw this wonderful crowd of people that had marched out to the cemetery, and he knew he wasn't going to have an audience like that for a long time, so he went on and on. Rain was pelting down, but finally it ended. And when it did, the 6 pallbearers said, "Let's go back to the new hotel in the San Carlos, get a cup of coffee, dry out." And they did. And as they sat there, the conversation got a little maudlin. You've probably been in situations like this. And they began to share experiences. One man said, I was out in the woods on a survey just a couple of months ago, and he said, 40 years, we have cut darn near all this wonderful timber. What are we going to do when it's gone? Another man said, "Oh, yes, it's terrible." And he said, "Look at what's happened to the merchants up and down the street. They're closing one after another. They're broke." Third man said, "Yes, and as I read the newspapers, they could be at war in Europe any day now. What will happen to the rest of our markets if that happened?" Well, with this very somber tone, the men finally adjourned. I want you to get the date. It's the 14th of April, 1914. It was the 19th of June, 1963, when Carl Burton's bank back here, dedicated a new 4-story building on the corner of Balin and Garden Street. And that was the first building of greater than 2 stories built in Pensacola in 50 years. And the only exception was a WPA project post office at Chase and Palafox. Pensacola, in short, went into an era when it was a capital-starved city, a plateau. Very little happened in the way of building, construction, architecture, new businesses, what have you. The only exceptions to that were a few manufacturing companies which opened on the periphery of the city or out at Cantonment and places like that. They, of course, had nothing to do with the downtown economy or its look. Now, that'll give you an idea of why things stayed the same for so long, only beginning to change in appearance after the mid-1960s. Now let's turn the clock back, or the calendar back, to the year 1870. Pensacola, like all of the South, was coming out of a very devastating war. Let's assume that all of you had been citizens of this town. You'd fled the city. Actually, everybody left except 72 men and women who were very, very, very bold. They stayed around, but despite the Yankees arriving. You left, you were gone for 3.5 years. Finally, you begin to trickle back, and when you get here, you find that Reconstruction has been set in. You've got federal soldiers marching up and down the streets. You've got no money. What money you had in Southern currency is worthless. And you go through 4 absolutely miserable years of trying to rebuild, put your houses back in order, rebuild your churches and what have you. And then, as I mentioned before, the lumbering era suddenly began. Now, I want you to kind of look at this, at the picture next of the 1870s. Things begin to percolate now. And the area in which we are presently sitting, the so-called Old Pensacola, is a collection of buildings that date basically from, a few of them from the 1840s and 50s, but most of them we see coming on site here, beginning with after 1866 to 70 to 75. And you'll notice, first of all, about these buildings. This is the so-called historic district. Number one, the first of them that you see, most of them anyway, are very simple in construction. A lot of them were called the so-called shotgun houses that Ken Wolfe used to build back there. And virtually all of them were built of wood. Now, beginning in the 1820s, when the forts that protected the Navy Yard out here, when the forts went under construction, William Chase, who came here as the engineer, made deals with 7 different men who went up and down the Escambia River. They found appropriate deposits of clay. And they went into brick business. So they were making brick by the millions, 20 million for Fort Pickens, 10 million for Fort McRae, 10 million for Barrancas. Brick was here, but when you got, and the availability was here, but when you get into the 1870s and a little bit and beyond, they didn't build houses or even public buildings of wood, of brick or stone. It was all of wood. And why? Because when the lumbering era began, lumber mills came into this area. They came out of the ground almost like peanuts growing. By the time we got to 1878, there were 65 known lumber mills of some size located within 65 to 70 miles of Pensacola. Several of them were right down here on the waterfront. One of them was right opposite 14th Avenue, another one a little bit further to the east. These were good-sized mills. They built their docks out into the water. They were manufacturing centers, employed a lot of people. Now, wood was being turned out in virtually any form you wanted it. So if you were going to build your house and you could get it for practically nothing, would you build with brick or would you with wood? And the answer was you built with wood. The other thing that you can cite, and this is the architect's purview, of course, but just in this period, 2 men up in Ohio named Libby and Owens had developed new forms of new manufacturing methods for making windows. So you begin to see the formation, the style of the houses change because you can make larger window panes and make glass less expensive. So the area that we're talking about is the so-called Old Historic Pensacola, which is basically south of Government Street and generally east of Halifax. The old Pensacola comes into being in that era. And people live there, they work there, and most of the early construction after that creeps to the north and a little bit to the west. Now, in 1876, another major thing happens to the Pensacola beyond the lumbering era. In that year, the L&N Railroad restructures or reconstructs itself between Pensacola and Flomaton Junction. It had been built and completed in 1860, and it was torn up and destroyed by the retreating Confederates in 1862. So in the early part of the lumbering era, we had no transportation other than by water. I want to emphasize that again to you because we won't have time today to talk about the whole story of transport. But remember this, until 1936, there were no paved roads running along the Gulf of Mexico outside of Pensacola. If you wanted to go from here to Panama City, you rode a ship or a boat or a barge of some sort. Ditto in the other direction. There were rutted roads, clay, sand, and so forth that you could have ridden on, of course, but they were certainly not good transport. We did not have our first automobile owned and driven in Pensacola until 1906. And if the steamship Tarpon had not been put in service between here and Panama City and Carabel and all the little towns to the east, those people down there never would have developed as cotton export centers because we were the hub. But now, looking at 1876 again. In this era, the railroad comes in and they begin to make plans to do all kinds of wonderful things. People now begin, with the lumbering industry starting here, you had to have people. And people begin to come principally from the Carolinas, Maine, Michigan, and Wisconsin. These are people experienced in the lumbering trade. They have pretty well cut over the available lumber up there. So men with capital and experience begin to come to Pensacola. Some of them join existing lumber companies like those up and down the Blackwater at the Simpson Lumber Company, but most of them are starting out with new companies. And again, they can buy timber tracts for 25 cents an acre. When we talk about what they put together, we're talking about 100,000 acre tract would have been small potatoes. 200, 250, 300,000 acres was what they would get, and they would begin cutting it, bringing people in. And of course, those people were working pretty much away from Pensacola, but they would get off, finish their work maybe at noon on Saturday, and the companies would run their transport into the town here, and we'd have all these workmen here having a good time from noon on Saturday until time to go back to work on Sunday. So you can begin to see the beginning of a whole new industry that nobody had planned on. That is, we talk about the entertainment industry today, and I kid my friends who produce The Weekender and the Independent Sun and places like that, and what they advertise for weekend fun. And I will tell you, it's a lot different today than it was in 1876. This was when we had more bars and saloons per square foot than you can imagine, all of them centered on Lower Palafox Street. A little bit, now there was another part of the entertainment industry. There's a little bit more to the west. Ladies, excuse me for telling you this. But they called this the Line, and that the Line ran east and west along Zaragoza Street, north and south along Valen Street, and it was a very active place, well patrolled and policed by the police department of our community and the courts. In fact, some of the men who used to live and work in this building here used to tell stories about how they worked on that even prior to World War I. So it was around a while, and it was a very productive industry. Well, through the 1870s, with the coming of the railroad, people begin to build slowly in a direction out from that original core. Now, by the time we get to 1878 or 80, the obvious economics are beginning to take form. Because now, some of you, like Bill Smart back there, he's built his mill, he's turning out lumber like nobody's business, and Bill is making money, lots of money. And just remember now, no income tax, no new Cadillac every year, can't fly on the Concorde to Europe. So what are you going to do with your money? Basically, you start thinking about a nice new house. And this is when the city begins to spread north, particularly from, roughly from Tarragona Street to maybe Roos, and north up as far, roughly to Cervantes Street. Now, bear in mind, we're talking about 1878 to 80. And this is particularly of importance to the ladies, because you're planning what it's going to look like. There are no utilities, zero. No running water, no electricity, no natural gas. And your new house, this gentleman here has planned this lovely house. He's building a modest one there up on the hill, 6,500, 7,000 square feet. But he has to have an addition out back, and that is the private, or the privy, because every one that was built at that time had to be constructed that way. We were still that primitive in Pensacola at this time. But the growth was there. Now, when we get to 1880, the town begins to change a little bit more. Now, happily, we've got a few maps left that show what it was like just going north up Palafox Street. Just put your mental spectacles on for a minute and think in terms of a few locations. On the corner of Palafox and Intendencia, on the east side, there is a building which has, I believe it's 5 stores in it. Those stores run from Intendencia right up to where the Saenger Theater is today. That building had been built by 1884. We're not sure who built it, but it was there. Each one of them was a shop. Each building, each unit in it was a shop. And across the street was a building which was built originally, again, for shops. It has been a set of offices in more recent times. But again, that was there by 1885. But then you go north and you find practically nothing, zero. Until you get up, and the surprising thing is, in 1880, one major change comes. That year, on the corner of Palafox and Garden Street, northwest corner, the Methodist Church decided they were going to change things. Now, people, you always want to look at why do people do these things. The Methodists had established a chapel at Tarragona and Intendencia Street back in the 1820s. It had been enlarged in the 1830s. It had lasted through the war, and now in 1880 they decided to move. They had enlarged the congregation somewhat, but the main reason was, and I think Carl Merton's father, or maybe it was his grandfather, was responsible for this. Somehow along the way, the Methodist and railroad engineers got into a tiff. And on Wednesday night during prayer meetings and Sunday morning during services, the railroad engineers who were shifting cargo boxcars from the freight yard up on Wright Street down to the docks, they would stop the engine in front of the old Methodist church, blow the whistle to set off steam, blow and ring the bell, and finally the Methodists had it, and so they gave up and bought the chicken farm that was over on that other corner and built the Methodist church. 25 years later, they sold it to two other men who tore the church down and built the San Carlos Hotel. So that's one step at a time is the way these things go. Well, now, the business community developed very slowly, moving north along Palafox Street. And because basically at first, the shops above government went east and west. You can find fortunately, a couple of years ago, a very wonderful gentleman came in and gave me a copy of the first ever city directory prepared for Pensacola. It was done in 1885. And you can just see that all the businesses, the cigar maker, the grocery stores, the people that made the candles, and people were still making candles in those days, they were all on the side streets. So Palafox went forward rather slowly. But by the time we get into the 1880s, they're building their buildings there now. And now I want you to think again what you see of buildings that are there today that were built probably 1885 to 90, maybe a little bit beyond that, up to the corner of Garden Street. These are now they're masonry buildings. Notice we're now moving away from the wooden structures. We're getting into masonry, some of it with stucco on the outside. That's when Kenneth Kahn built his building back there. Wasn't that 85, Nathan? Wake up. In any event, the structures that were being built along these streets were now made, and the architectural style was a kind of a hodgepodge, but a lot of it was being copied from what these people had seen in both Mobile and New Orleans. We were creating a sort of a Gulf Coast architecture with the protected area over what would have been a sidewalk if we'd had sidewalks, but people could walk down there with a kind of an apron type protection over the top. Now the city moved forward very slowly, but one thing began to change that in 1884-85, and that was the work of a young man who had come to Pensacola to work as a bookkeeper. They sent him up to St. Louis for some training, and when he got there, first thing he did as he stepped out of the Union Station was to see something that he'd never seen before. It was an omnibus, a horse-powered streetcar. And he said, this is what Pensacola needs. So he came back, found a couple of partners, got an agreement from the city to build it, and ran a streetcar, horse-drawn streetcar, from the docks to Wright Street, where the L&N depot had just been erected. Now, it was perfectly logical. These were the two interconnections that people needed most, and that, of course, opened up the city, because now people could easily move back and forth along Palafox north to south, and shortly thereafter he had some interconnecting lines east to west on other streets. And after a couple of years, he discovered that business was wonderful from Monday morning until Saturday noon, and then it sort of died off. Of course, that was when the business community sort of died back for the weekend. And he did then what other streetcar entrepreneurs had done in other cities. He built an amusement park out on the west side, connected that, of course, to the streetcar line. And so now you could ride out to Coupe Friand's Park, which was where Pat Groner lived for a while, just west of Baptist Hospital. In fact, if you traipse around in that beautiful wooded area today, you can still find little bits of the hump that took care of that was the racetrack that they had for horse racing, because horse racing became a big thing here for a time around 1900. So first of all comes the north and south railroad, then the streetcar. And then in 1882, the L&N built the second major railroad in and out of here, this one from Pensacola east. Now, that began to make a lot of changes. Now, again, the ladies will appreciate this more than the gentlemen. But at this point in time, Pensacola, other than the bars and saloons, we had precious little in what we would call today modern quality of life. There was no entertainment, no culture, this sort of thing. But in 1882, the owners of the First National Bank, which was operated then in a building on the corner of Government and Jefferson, called a little meeting like this and said, "Gentlemen, we want to make an announcement. We're going to build a new bank building." And everyone applauded very politely, and they said, "But what we're going to do, it's going to take part of the square footage of a much larger building, which is going to be an opera house, and it's going to seat 1,000 people." Now, this is 1882. We might have, stretching things a little bit, we might have had 7,500 people within earshot within the entire, and most of these were rough and tumble lumberjack sort of. And of course, the people thought these guys have lost their minds. What they didn't know was, of course, that up north, up in the Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, what were known as vaudeville circuits were being formed, and this allowed them to import a regular stream of quality talent to use that opera house. And as long as we had the railroad, you could do that. And was it a success? Well, it gives you an idea of how commerce would develop. Now, this lovely lady here, she and her husband have tickets for tonight at the Opera House. They're going to see Maude Adams in one of her dramas. And so she has gone out to one of the dressmakers in town, bought a beautifully made new frock. She has these new high-button shoes and gloves and a hat with all sorts of ribbons. And she just, she's just going to look uptown when she goes to this show tonight. And they're going to one of the fine restaurants along Palafox Street at the Santa Rosa House or the Nick Apostles restaurant. They're going to have a wonderful time. Now, she and her husband also have tickets for Saturday night to hear Sousa's band at the Opera House. Now, the men won't appreciate this, but the women will. You know that she could not possibly wear the same attire on Saturday night that she wore on Tuesday, and therefore the dressmakers, the bootmakers, and all just flourished, and Pensacola suddenly exploded as a commercial town. Now, in 1885, something else happened. Actually, two things. We began to really move into the utilities era. 2 years before, the telephone company had opened its office here, and by then we were putting poles up and down Palafox Street. We were beginning to move telephone service into the city. In 1885, a private company began building a water system. They put their standpipe up on the high point, which was then called Gage's Hill, and the water system was there to provide for homes, residences, businesses, and also for fire protection. It was a big, big move for Pensacola. Made a tremendous change in the way people began to build their houses. And of course, that meant as people moved north with their residences, they were the people with money, and that influenced what the churches did. So beginning in the mid-1880s, beginning with St. Michael's and then all of the other main Protestant churches, they began to build their new structures up and down the area to the north. The Lutherans had gotten here about a little bit earlier than that. They built their first church beginning in 1880. But in 83, we began building St. Michael's. In 87, we began building the Presbyterian Church. 2 years later, the Baptists began working on theirs. The Episcopalians don't get around to their new one until 1903. But nonetheless, the succession is there, so you can see as the population moves north, the churches move north with them, and all those structures are there with you. Well, we move into the early part of the gracious, time goes by. We're into the early part of the 20th century, and now business is so good. This is before the bank failures. Business is so good, people are making money, and now things began to change even more. 1900, a group of people come in here and they announce that they are going to take over the area just vacated by the First National Bank in the Opera House. They're going to build a bank on the corner of Jefferson and Government, so that they're in business. And we now have 4 national banks that are all of them able to print their own currency. The business is just booming. In 1903, a man by the name of Conrad Teason did something that people again thought was rather strange. Mr. Teason was a Dane. He had come here and opened a bar down in the south end of the town. He'd made a lot of money, and he was quite prosperous, but his wife just objected all through the prosperous years because she didn't think running a saloon was a proper trade for a man of a gentleman. So Teason said, okay, I'm going to use my money for something else, and he did. He bought property on the corner of Romana and Palafox, and he built the Teason Building, which was a 5-story structure with an elevator, first one in Pensacola. And that Teason Building was the tallest building in all of Florida at that time. 2 years went by. At this point in time, my friend Francis Brent, whom I mentioned a little while ago for his funeral, he and an attorney by the name of William Alexander Blunt had purchased much of the building, or the block rather, bounded by Palafox, Garden, Romana, and Balin. And the Blunt building was 3 stories tall, the Brent building 2 stories, and there were a lot of other lesser buildings in the same block. On Halloween night in 1905, fire broke out, fire of still undetermined origin, and virtually leveled that block. In fact, for a time during the night, they feared that the whole lower end of the town might go, but it finally was stopped about 4 o'clock. Brent and Blunt the next day announced to the public that they were going to rebuild bigger and better than ever, fireproof construction, and they did. And so when you walk to the corner of Palafox and Garden today, you find the 7-story Blunt building, the 3-story Brent building, And that was they were the cornerstones of what was to be done at that point in time. 2 years later, the story that I told you a minute ago about the hotel came to be. And again, this is an outreach of why. Two of the men who had made a lot of money in lumbering one of them was named Frank Bingham, and the other one was James Malden. And these two men looked around. They had traveled a great deal, and they said, Pensacola is going great. It has a new railroad station. It has a new Teason building. Things are going well, but it lacks one thing to make it a first-class city. It does not have a good hotel. Now, it had some hotels, one of which was brand new. It was a 3-story commercial hotel called the Manhattan on West Garden Street, but it wasn't you didn't put it in the same category as the Edgewater Beach, the Palmer House, that sort of thing. So these men went in, they bought the property from the Methodist Church and tore it down and built the first section of the San Carlos Hotel. And the San Carlos opened on the 10th of February in 1910. Now, again, the why. Pensacola was beginning to attract a lot of visitors, but one thing that we wouldn't even have counted on today, we count on people coming for the Fiesta of Five Flags, but back in those days, beginning in 1900, the Mardi Gras had become big-time visitor for business for Pensacola. Now, I don't know that this is true, but the newspaper accounts in several different years said that as many as 30,000 people had come into Pensacola to attend Mardi Gras. And of course, this was what was attracting the businessmen to build a new hotel, and they rushed like crazy to have it ready for visitors for 1910. And indeed, the first man to come was a traveling salesman from Birmingham who said he had hurried here so he could be in on the Mardi Gras fun. And so that was the beginning of the San Carlos. The same year, the American National Bank had outgrown its facilities in the old Opera House, and so they announced that they were going to build a new building as well. And they startled people just as everyone else did. They bought what was then called the Clubs Building. It was a wooden 3-story building on the corner of Palafox and Government Street, northeast corner. They tore it down and began construction in 1908 and was finished in the latter part of 1910. And this was the 11-story American National Bank building, which we today call the Seville Tower. And it was finished then. First 2 stories were for the bank. The remaining stories, of course, were for professional offices. And that basically was the cornerstone on that decade. Now, just about the same time, you can just use your own memories to begin to think what was happening in the world. Just about this time, motion pictures have now become a fact of life. And in 1913, we have the first real motion, we had some little ones before, first real motion picture house was built on the corner of Palafox and Garden. It was the ISIS Theater. And others followed shortly thereafter, moving north up Palafox Street. Sadly, in 1917, 16 and 17, 3 hurricanes hit the area, bing, bing, bing like that, and pretty well damaged the old Opera House. And by this time, motion pictures were taking their toll, and so the owners of the Opera House decided they would demolish it and go out of the opera business. Fortunately for us, and I want to challenge you to do this now, fortunately for us, the man who tore that building down was a contractor named Charlie Turner. And Turner looked at all that beautiful work that was inside, all the trim and the things that had made that Opera House so beautiful, and he put some of it in a warehouse. And by good fortune, 7 years later, he was contracted to build what became the Saenger Theater. So when you sit down in the Saenger, next time you can look to the walls or to the ceiling and try to guess which pieces of it that you're looking at now were actually part of the old Opera House, which came to its end, as I say, in 1917. Well, by the time we get into the latter part of the teen years, Pensacola has pretty much taken its form. Now, the lower part of the city has had some fires, and we've changed some of that. The western part of the city, just to the west of Ruth Street, has had a change. Now, this is not one that has, even today, makes a whole lot of difference. If Tom Bonfield was here, we could talk a little bit about that area this afternoon, but we won't. That is the area in which the Panton-Leslie Trading Post had existed beginning in the 1780s. And in later times after that, what they called the tan yard had been put there. That was where they tanned the hides and so forth that had come in from the Indians. And that was a separate kind of neighborhood that never became fashionable. And so when people went in there and decided to tear down a house or two, no one got too excited about it. Now, I've given you an overview of what happened and why. Prosperity, population, changes in interest, the banking industry, capital in the hands of people who could do something. All of these contributed to Pensacola growing as it did up until the middle of the teen years. But as I say, beginning in 1914, even though the semblance of prosperity was still here and would remain so up until the Depression, the capital was absent. And so no new great ventures came along, no new great buildings came along. So there were faceliftings, of course, but basically it stayed pretty much the same. They electrified the streetcars in 1897. That made a little difference, not a great deal. But basically, if you take a look at an aerial photograph taken around the time of World War I and compare it with mentally with what I've given you today, you'll see basically what the city was. Now, what we have seen in more recent times, of course, is what has happened as architecture has changed. Capital has returned to the Pensacola area. High-rise buildings are being constructed, and all sorts of exciting things are here for the future. Now, the last question I would leave with you is, what is it that is going to be the propelling force against change tomorrow? Because always in the past there has been something. One thing I neglected to say before, and it needs to have a word in here just for your perspective. One of the great heroes, at least in my eyes, of Pensacola's history was a man named William Dudley Chipley. Chipley came here to work for the railroad. He was the one that built the line between Pensacola and River Junction. And he then went on to be Mr. Everything for Pensacola for about 25 years. Chipley was the man who succeeded in getting the first of the men anyway, who succeeded in getting the board of directors of the L&N Railroad to build beautiful wharves up and down the area from Palafox Street to the east along the bay. The wharves, the docks, trackage, the rail yard, all of this was a major contribution of the railroad. And so that by the time we get into the early 1900s, this was a big railroad town. We had that railroad, and we also had another one that was just beginning to the west, which had several names. We'll just call it the one that's easiest to remember, the Muscle Shoals, Birmingham, and Pensacola, which is one I'm sure you all remember well. Later on, it became the Frisco. But nonetheless, railroading was big because people had belief that we were going to be a really manufacturing town. I haven't touched upon the fishing industry because that really didn't make much of an impact on what the city looked like later. But I would just mention for just a moment that at one time, beginning between 1870 and 1910, we had two major fishing companies down on the south end of the city, one of them based on Palafox Wharf, the other on Balin Street Wharf. And these companies employed over 1,000 people collectively. They would handle something in the neighborhood of 600,000 pounds of dressed fish that was shipped out of Pensacola every year. That could not have happened, of course, before the railroad came and the ice-making plants came. But all of this, you see, collectively made up your economy. But the big thing was lumber. And as the men at the funeral predicted, beginning, it wasn't quite so in 1914, but by the time 1925 had come along, the lumbering era was over. And when it was over, Pensacola changed. It went to sleep. And we're just now really waking up. Okay, questions? I'm sorry?
When were our city limits established?
City limits? Well, Andrew Jackson arrived here in 1821, and he had the charter for the city of Pensacola in his pocket, but no one established what the city was. Spanish had never gone around to doing that. Only 700 people here, so people didn't worry much about it. So Andrew Jackson got on his horse, this is the story anyway, and rode out to Bayou Chico, and at a point on the northern side of the northern neck of Bayou Chico began riding east and did so in a kind of an arc that went all the way to what some people later called Lake Tahar. And that's the way the northern boundary of the city of Pensacola was established, and it remained pretty much the same until the 1950s. Yes, sir?
So when did North Hill begin to develop?
North Hill?
As a residential area?
Well, the North Hill area, we got to define what it is, really. But basically, if we talk from Gregory Street north, up into past Cervantes on up there, if you said it began, beg pardon?
North.
Well, okay. You've basically the structural work began south of Cervantes about 1878. And they began to sell houses and then lots and promote that area sometime later than that. I can give you one hallmark, one benchmark you can look at. As I mentioned before, the Turner family were leading contractors here, and Charlie Turner bought a lot at the corner of Balin, I think it's Balin and Strong, the first street up past Cervantes, on the southeast corner of that street. And he,
Southwest.
Southeast. It's a gray, bluish-gray house. Charlie Turner's house was a blue-gray house, and his brother, his grandson owns it today. And that he built that for his wife and him to move into on their wedding night in 1889. So you can get an idea that there was action up there. Turner then bought that whole block, and he built speculative houses down the street south of him, and then two others for members of his family east of him. So, but it was, the action was there. But now again, you can judge when they were built a little bit more easily by how fancy they become, because the more money the people have, the fancier the house is, which is perfectly logical. By the way, ladies, since that question leads into it, women's magazines like Southern Living, Better Homes and Gardens, they were around at this time just as they are today. And there were very few architects here. Ken hadn't quite gotten here yet. And what a lot of these builders did, they were design build contractors. The ladies would save these pictures of things they liked out of the magazines. They would call the contractor, or the contractor in. He would make a design based on what they said they wanted, plus the pictures, and that's the way a lot of these things were done. There were two large mills nearby that manufactured all the fancy stuff, the outdoor, the balusters, balustrades, the fancy windows and so window frames. Anyway, they were nearby. And so it was easy to do and cheap to build a big house of that kind. But bear in mind, you did not have utilities to speak of until, well, you didn't have anything other than water until into the late 1890s and early 1900s. The first electric generating plant we had here was about 1897 down on the waterfront, and it was primarily built there to power the streetcars. And they had a little extra capacity, and they sold it off. And the man that started the gas works, this was not natural gas, but manufactured gas. He came in here, and his primary mission was to provide gas for streetlights. And he had a little left over, so he would sell it off to somebody as well. I hope that answers your question. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I wonder if the Chamber Music Society was just organized this year, and I wonder if there was anything like that before.
Music? Well, that's a whole other story. The answer is yes. But let me take questions first of all, if you don't mind, on the subject we've had today. And if you want to talk about this later on, we'll be glad to. But the answer is yes. We by the time we get to the late 1890s, young people like you were taking to the new styles of dance music, and we had the John Paul Jones and the Foot Stompers and the Rainbow Boys Orchestra and Clutter's Music House down here on Palafox Street. Dancing had come, and we had all kinds of little bands and combos. We did not have a big orchestra or a chamber orchestra until 1926, but in that year you had two of them start. Yes?
Even though it appears we didn't wake up yet, you indicated that we maybe at least staggered groggily out of bed in the 60s. What happened there?
What happened in the 60s? Well, basically, there was no major push that caused a lot of things to happen simultaneously, as there had been in the 70s and 80s. There was nothing like that. If you go down in the southern part of the city, you see some very, very nice high-rise buildings, 7-8-story buildings down there now. But they were all basically built because people felt there was a demand for more office space. Pensacola, again, some of you who were here a long time ago can appreciate this. The newcomers will have difficulty. Beginning in the mid-1960s, with the suburbia arrived in Florida, in Northwest Florida, just as it did many other places. And people began building subdivisions out. And when that happened, people, the business community began to desert downtown Pensacola a step at a time. It didn't happen all at once overnight. But as that happened, of course, the Sears, the Pennies, the people like that, they gradually move out. And what was happening was that a lot of the things that were done were a calculated effort to keep professional people downtown. One of the problems that they had, for example, that back into the 1960s, many of the physicians in this town had their offices in the Brent building, the Teason building, places like that. But now with the coming of Baptist Hospital and others, they began to move out because the physicians wanted their offices near the hospital. And so there was space there, and the commercial enterprises had to find a way to attract lawyers, architects, and that sort of thing for them. Yes, sir.
A little bit of an answer to his question, John. To me, the biggest boom in Pensacola from 1900 forward was when Hemstrand moved to Pensacola. I was in the Army and I came back in 1953, and it was unbelievable the change from 1950 to when Hemstrand came in, which is now Solution. But they brought in 5,000 or more employees, and to me that was the biggest thing that had happened in Pensacola in that 1950s.
Indeed, it happened in Northwest Florida. I would kind of debate you on whether that happened in the immediate area of downtown Pensacola. They bought. This noon, Dr. Ford made an address to a Rotary Club downtown talking about what is happening in many places, hopefully in Pensacola, is when you get certain types of people coming attracted to an area who are bringing brain power industry into the area. That's exactly what Monsanto or Chemstrand did. And of course, along with them came American Cyanamid and Air Products and the rest of them. We had a boom, but very little of that came into play in the downtown area. We still continued to lose businesses, and we lost residents as well. Any others? Yes, sir.
John, that period from 1914 to 1963, where it was dormant in town, that's the real time where naval aviation really boomed. But there was no connection between the two?
Well, let me take you back a little bit.
Okay.
The Navy Yard began here in 1826, operated in a very minor role up to the war between the states. There was a serious question at the end of that war whether it would be continued. That was when we had the first of the BRAC commissions. That yard went, well, seriously, that yard went through 4 of those before the pressure was finally put on, and the Navy Yard shut down on the 1st of October 1911. They simply padlocked the property. They didn't know what they were going to do with it. And then in 1914, of course, the Navy decided to transfer aviation training from Annapolis here. Now, we look at the Naval Air Station and all of its wonderful activities today, and we kind of have a transfer picture that was the same back then. Remember, when they arrived, there were 7 airplanes, there were 25 pilot trainees, and another 25 adjutant personnel. No wives went with them. This was they occupied portions. At least I believe they occupied portions of what was the old Warrington and Woolsey villages that had been built to accommodate people working at the Navy Yard. You've got to remember. Well, you can just think of it yourself. How long it takes you today to drive from downtown Pensacola to, let's say, the Naval Aviation Museum. It's a long ride, and back in those days, you had nothing in the way of roads to speak of. Consequently, it was a difficult thing, and the population around that grew very slowly. Now, there was a spurt. The Navy Yard, the Pensacola Aeronautical Station was a kind of a sine curve. Its numbers went like this. When we were in hostilities, as we were in 1917-18, the numbers went up. When the 20s came along, it was pretty much of a plateau. We had in the early 30s, we had 2 years when there wasn't a single class of aviators graduated from that place out there. So as far as it being a tremendous stimulus then, it wasn't. But when you get into the 1939 and forward, then the whole picture changes. Any others? Ken?
When did the electric trolley start and when did it stop?
When did the...
When electric
Well, okay. Electric trolleys. Well, actually, it's in two parts. The trolley itself, as I say, started in 1884, and the routes were expanded slightly, generally going from the waterfront to the depot, and then there were some side streets. They were electrified in 1897, and then in 1892, and also in 1892, another route was developed between Pensacola and the Navy Yard. It ran along the waterfront, and this was a steam engine driven railroad that they called the dummy line, because they were using dummy style engines that were, why they got that name I don't know. They were made originally for forestry, but they got that name. That railroad was electrified in 1911, and it remained in service as an electric operation until 1956 or 7. On the downtown streets, the electric company which owned the railroad system was acquired by Gulf Power Company in 1926. So Gulf owned the streetcar system. They chose to this is a kind of a hard thing to understand. They chose to go out of the electric business as far as streetcars was concerned in 1931, and they introduced buses. So it was 1931, 1st of January, that these electric streetcars went up. Any others? Well, if not, thank you so much. You've been a great group. Hope you've gotten a little bit out of it. Thank you very much.